Okay, my apologies for the delay.
No
All right,
worries.
let me start. Could you see me? Is it all clear?
Perfect.
Beautiful. Okay, thank you. Now, Parsha Weekly Torah, Woman of the Forbidden Fruit. What's that? Okay, we're now streaming live on Facebook. Beautiful. So, this week's portion is Bereshit, which is probably the most important in a certain way of all portions. I think that if you wanted to, you could run a Shiur, a class, a whole year just on this week's portion. And I've said this every year when I get to this, and then I think there's like Margarita in the past or somebody in the past that says, oh, let's do it. And you're 100% right. It could be a fascinating talk every single week just on this week's portion. Because this week's portion is Bereshit. Now, one of the strange things about Bereshit, it's probably one of the most understudied portions. You know why that is? Because, well, A, it's quite a long portion. The commentaries are so immense. And B, because we normally are coming straight from Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, and we only conclude the Torah on Simchat Torah. And that gives us, sometimes we could finish the Torah, Simchat Torah could be Friday. That means that you have one day, and then you go straight into the next day is Bereshit, and then you finish Bereshit, you're straight into Parashat Noach. This week we have basically for the first time almost an entire week to study Bereshit. Not for the first time, for the first time in a while that we have such an opportunity. So to be able to give a shiur on Bereshit before actually reading it in the Torah is something which is unique to me. So what I decided to do, I often focus on a different element of Bereshit. And as I said, we can talk about so many aspects of it. Of course, the creation of man is fascinating. And the whole story of the Garden of Eden and eating from the tree of knowledge. And many of these elements we have actually touched on in the past. But what I wanted to talk about today is the first day of creation, the first few verses of the Torah. I wanted to try to focus on those first 5 or 6 verses of the Torah and give you a little bit of enlightenment into it, because once you know those first few verses, you will find such a different perspective, in my opinion, on Judaism and the Torah and the importance of the Torah, just from the knowledge of these first few verses and their significance. You know, when we look through these verses, we think about them as interesting. You know, it says that God created, does it fit scientifically, or we don't look at it as something which has so many levels of meaning necessarily. And I think the more we study, the more we realize how much meaning and elements there are to these verses and to every part of Torah. As I just said to somebody the other day, I think it was my son, that the more you know, the more you study, the more you realize you don't know. And the best place to start is right over here at the beginning. So I want to do something. I'm going to share a little bit of the screen. I'm going to share with you the verses from the Torah. Okay, could you see my screen? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Let's look right at the beginning. Verse 1. Verse 1 says, let's read the English and then we'll focus in on the on the Hebrew, because the real meaning you could only really get when you analyze the Hebrew. So it says, in the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and earth. Now, you'll notice this is a Chabad.org, and this is translated based on commentaries. In other, really, the way, if you opened in most Chumashim, you would say it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the world, in the earth. Over here, we're translating it in the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth. In other words, there was actually something. What's the beginning? But let's focus on the Hebrew now. The first word is Bereshit. Now, Bereshit, what does that mean? So most people think it means in the beginning, and that's true. That's the basic meaning. Reshit means the beginning. But what is this beginning? So look at the word again, and look what it says. The word is Reshit, means the beginning. What's the beginning? Beginning of what? What are we starting with? What beginning are we talking about? What's at the beginning of? What's the beginning? Beginning of what?
Creation of the heaven and the earth.
Beginning of creation of the heaven and earth. Okay, that's so that's the way we're translating it. It's the beginning of God creation of the heavens and earth. But here we're going to say it's in the beginning, Bereshit, in God's beginning. In other words, there's something that caused God to want to create a heavens and earth. Why did God create a heavens and earth in the first place? Have you ever stopped and said, why did God actually create the heavens and earth? So you know where the answer to this question is? Right in the beginning. Right in the beginning is where God gives you the answer to why he even made a beginning. You have to, in order to start something, you have to have a reason. And if a human being starts something, because we're logical, and when we're generally logical beings, and we have sense, so when we start doing something, we're going to start off with a reason and a purpose to what we're doing. Now, why would we think any less of God? Why would we think that God would just randomly create a world without a purpose when we ourselves wouldn't do that? Now, if we wanted to get any insight into God and say, well, God created this universe, and this universe is beyond anything that we can even dare to imagine the magnitude of this universe. Yet the being that created it must have had some massive, massive mission and purpose and reason for doing it. Right? Now, it sounds massive. Maybe it's not so massive. Maybe it's just massive in our eyes. So where do we know where the creator actually tells us where, like, how do we know what the creator's reason? How would we figure that out? How would we figure out what the creator's mission and purpose is? Well, we would find out if God ever, the creator, ever gave us some type of blueprint or plans, right? If you have a architect that you want to draw something, the first thing you do is the architect doesn't draw something himself. He has to go to the, let's say you want to build a house or a big, beautiful, let's say a big palace. I would assume that, let's say the king desires to build a palace. He wouldn't say, okay, I'm looking for the best architect in the world. Okay, I want you to just design for me whatever you want, however you want it, make it as best as you can. I highly doubt that would happen. I'm sure he would give him a basic idea of what he wants, and only afterwards would he then go and create it or design it, right? He's got a plan, and those plans would be later drawn up. There's a plan to God's creation. There's a plan of why he did this. There's a reason to why he did this. When you study the first line of this Torah, you'll be able to understand a huge amount about the world, a huge amount about what's happening. Because when we don't have the bigger picture in mind, everything looks like it's it's its own little idea that has no bigger picture, no bigger meaning to it. It's so important when studying Torah to realize that everything has a much bigger picture and reason around it. Okay? So the reason behind why God created the world is central. The first thing you'd have to do is ask that question, why did God create? And he'll tell us this, Beis Reshit. The word Beis means two. Beis is the numerical value. Every letter of the alphabet also has a number, right? So Aleph is the first letter, equals 1. Bet is the second letter, equals 2. Bereshit, Beis Reshit. The beginning has two reasons. Now, the rabbinic texts tell us what those reasons are. Beis Reshit. What are those two reasons why God created the world? Well, he created. Torah and mitzvot.
In Israel. No,
Yes. Torah and Israel. Torah and the Jewish people. In other words, those were his two reasons. In other words, all this massive creation that he was doing, he was trying to achieve something else. He wants to have this ability to have a Torah, and he wants to be able to have the Jewish people fulfill that Torah. The Torah is his will. The Torah, the Jewish people are a part of his people. But in order to have that, he needs everything else around it. All the other creations, because Jewish people without a world, without other nations, are not the Jewish people, and the Torah without a world cannot be fulfilled. The only way we can fulfill it is if we have everything inside of it. So why does God create this entire world? Is for the Jewish people to be able to fulfill the Torah and to influence the rest of the world and to elevate them. So all those other parts are also essential to the world. Now, with that in mind, we're told in the Midrash says something else, that the reason why God created the world is because he was trying to create a home, a dwelling place in this world. He wanted to create a home, just like anybody that goes to an architect and wants to design something, build something. Why do they build it? Because they want a home. They want a place to live. He's going to this building. You go to your architect and you say, I want to build this. You buy a place. You know, today's day and age, not that I think in Australia it's becoming more and more popular because, you know, many people live in old houses, so they knock them down and rebuild them. But most of us never built, most people around the world haven't necessarily built their own homes. They've bought a home that's pre-existing, right? But the idea is the same. You're going to search for a house that you're looking for. But why would anybody, that had to be built by somebody? Why do we build homes? Because we need a place to live. We need a place to be us. We need a place that we could say, this is my place. This is where I am. This is where I live. This is where I feel at home. This is where I feel comfortable. God wanted that. So that's why he created the world. He wanted a place to feel at home. But what did he want? Strangely enough, he wanted to feel at home in a place that doesn't see him. It's not recognizable to him. He wanted to hide himself, and inside that place where he's hidden, in other words, where he's there, but we can't see him, over there he wanted to be revealed. That's quite incredible. That's a powerful thing. So and then he gives us through these two tools, how are we going to achieve that? Bereshit, with these two tools, the Jewish people and the Torah are going to achieve God's ultimate goal of creating a dwelling place for him. You know, today I went to help with a Brit Milah. Of course, with COVID restrictions, we can't have many people. It was just myself and the male that needed to help in somebody's house. And it was an Israeli family, and they gave the name Adam, which I thought they never even realized. It just said, we're looking for a new beginning, which I thought was nice. I said, you know, a surprising thing, that's this week's Torah portion. They never even realized that. But we're told that everything that, every name that a child gives comes as an inspiration from God and has a direct connection with that soul. So it's not just a new beginning, it's also an inspiration from God. So so when we wanted to know what's God's plan, his blueprint, how do we figure out what God wants from us? The way we would figure that out is by looking in the Torah. Okay? All the secrets are here. You just have to be able to find them, unravel them. Okay, so let's look at this verse. Bereshit bara Elokim. Now, the word Bereshit, as I explained, bara is creation, Elokim. Now, what is Elokim? Elokim. How would we translate Elokim? How would we translate Elokim? Elokim is God. God. But there's two main names that we have for God. There's numerous names that we have for God, but the two main ones, Ador, and then we have Nai. That we don't say that in vain, right? And Elohim. Now, why is this name used over here? Why does we use that? Who created God? We don't say Yud Ke Vav Ke, which we refer to as Havaya, Ador, Adnai. We don't say Adnai created God, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, which is the essence of God. We say Elokim. Elokim is the concealment over God. Why do we say that? Why is it the same? So we're told that when God created the world, he did it with Elokim. Now, if you look at the numerical value of this word, it's Aleph is 1, Lamed is Hey, that's 31. Another Hey is 36, plus Yud is 10, and Mem is, so that's 46, plus another, it's 86. The numerical value of the word Elokim is 86. Now, how would you say the nature in Hebrew? Nature. You know, have you ever heard of people that say that they believe in nature? Mother Nature created such a beautiful, you know, as though Mother Nature has its own identity. You know, the world was created by Mother Nature. Or, you know, Mother Nature is talking and sending us a message. Who's this Mother Nature? Tells us the Torah, Elokim, the word Hateva. So let's go. It's Ha-Teva, which means that's the Hey is 5, Tet is 9, that's 14. Vet is 2, that's 16, plus Ayin, 70 plus 16, that's 86. So the word Elokim and Hateva tells us that God hid himself in nature. God is this nature, this thing that people are trying to, so to speak, hide behind everything, is really God. Nature doesn't have its own identity. Nature doesn't get angry at people. Nature has no brain. There's no brain to nature. The brain of nature is God. The Torah itself tells us that Elokim, God, is nature. God hides himself, conceals himself within nature. Now let's go further. The word et. Look at this word et for a second. I want to show you something. Okay. Could you see when I highlight it? Does it appear on your thing? You see
Yes.
what I'm highlighting? Yes, okay. So when it says that word et is aleph and taf, can anyone tell me what is interesting about the aleph and taf?
Beginning and end.
The beginning and end. Very good. Very, very good. Why is it the beginning and end? Because what's the first letter of the alphabet? Aleph. What's the last letter of the alphabet? Taf. What does that teach us? Two things. You'll see, starting from verse 3, which is what I want to really focus on as well. Over here, it says, Vayomer Elokim, God said. Okay? Now, when we say God said, how many utterances are we say that God created the world with? God created the world with 10 utterances. How do we know that? Because 9 times in Genesis, in the 6 days of creation, it says the words, Vayomer Elokim, that Elokim, that God creates nature. He creates the world, nature, Elokim. The word Vayomer. Now, if Vayomer Elokim appears only 9 times, why do we say that there's 10 utterances? We should say there's 9 utterances. Anyone want to give a guess? No?
No.
Okay, here's the answer. Look back over here. Et. Bereshit bara Elokim et. The first creation that God creates, what does God create? Et. What is et? Aleph to taf. The alphabet. First, God creates language. God creates everything. The first thing he's going to create is he's going to create language. So you can't say, and God created, God said, let's create language, because that means that God's already created language in order to say. God first creates language, and then he's later one after able to go and say, Vayomer Elokim, and God said. So while the first, really it's 9 utterances plus 1 plain creation. So it's a little bit of a mind spin over there. Am I making any sense? I personally like it. Yeah, I like that one. But Aleph to Taf, it teaches us, I think this is from the Rebbe. It says, what was God's first creation? God's first creation is Aleph to Taf, language. The concept of language is a creation of God. Everything that exists is a creation of God. So this is what it's teaching us, God created. Now, Aleph to Taf was, I liked your words, Noach. You said Aleph to Taf. What does it represent? The beginning and the end. God creates the beginning and the end. God creates everything. You know, we talk about Mashiach going to be some type of miraculous time. That's already been created. Where was that created? Right over here. God created the beginning and the end, all over there. In the beginning, in the very beginning, God created it. The beginning and the end. It was all right there. Nothing's changed. From the beginning of creation, the end was already in place.
That almost eliminates free will. Or you could perceive it to be that way, because it's as if like we're working to a script.
Say that again. I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
That if everything's already been predefined and pre-created, does that apply to how we act as well? Does that take away free will?
Okay, so now you're getting into the discussion of the Pirkei Avot, right? The beginning of chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot. It says over there, that's where we get this concept of the 10 utterances. Over there, he says that in the beginning, God created. Sorry, it says over there that God created the world with 10 utterances. That's where we get this concept of 10 utterances from. Pirkei Avot, ethics of our fathers, right? And he says, why did he create it in 10 utterances? He could have created in one. Now, when he says he could have created in one, he really did create it in one. Look what the verse says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Boom, all done. Right? So, in other words, it's already been accomplished. So why do we need the other 9? Because look at the next verse. Look at the next verse. I don't know if I'm answering your question just yet, Noach. The next verse says, and the earth was astonishingly empty. Okay, now there was no earth to be empty, but there was nothing. God hadn't really created even darkness and light yet. Darkness and light comes later on. So, okay, so this is what it means. At the beginning, God creates everything in potential. In other words, God first, even the concept that there should be the concept of creation has to be created by God.
Yeah.
I know that's a little bit of a brain twister, because for our mind, what do you mean? Things exist. No, the very fact that things should be able to come into creation is all created within the first verse. Within the first verse, God says, I'm going to create a world that everything's going to come into existence. That is step number 1. Within that, everything is included. Right? But the problem with that would be that everything would be so almost the first one, too much for all the creations to exist. It would be too overpowering. The revelation of God would be so stark. So therefore, what he actually does is through creation, through the utterances, each utterance we're going to see is actually an element of concealment. It's a concealment, and that concealment allows for the free choice that you were talking about. Right? So everything is created, but in order to actually come into fruition, it needs to go through concealment. Okay, I'll hopefully expand on that as we go along. Okay, now let's look at the next word. The next verse is Et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, because God creates the heavens and the earth. Now, what does heavens and earth mean? There's two basic meanings for heavens and earth. One is heavens, as in earth. God created earth as we know it, even though in theory, not even earth itself has been created. But all the stars in the sky and the sun and the moon, that all comes later. But anything beyond earth, that's one opinion. Or really what it means, in more sophisticated, it means physicality and spirituality. God creates the concept of physicality and spirituality. Now, why do we need to have, what is spirituality? What is spirituality? Okay, we all use the word, but we don't necessarily have an easy way to connect to it. Spirituality is everything that isn't physical, but isn't God. Okay? God is not spiritual. God is not anything. because spirituality is a creation. The very fact that something is a creation means that it's not God. God is beyond anything that he creates. He's beyond time, he's beyond space, he's beyond being eternal, he's beyond being infinite. Because all those concepts, infinity, eternity, spirituality, physicality, space, time, all those things are creations. So you cannot tell me God is a spirit, because if God is a spirit, then God is a creation. And that's where a lot of people make a mistake. They think, well, God must be a spirit and therefore he must be created. No, but that goes against the very grain. We're saying in this verse, that's why I said this one verse is so important. God created the concept of spirituality. And therefore he's not spiritual. So what is he? He's God. No definition. I cannot give him a definition, because any definition that I will have is from my own understanding. Okay, so I'm just trying to give a new definition to what spirituality is. What is physicality? Physicality is the tangible, something that I could feel, that I can touch, that I can measure. That's physical. Anything that is measurable in some way or the other is physical. Anything that I cannot feel, touch. Sometimes spirituality can be felt, but that's not essentially what it is. But anything that's not measurable is probably a more precise description, is spirituality, but it's not God. And God is not spiritual. Okay. Now, why does God want us to have this concept of spirituality within the physicality?
Give meaning to the physicality.
Good. But the truth is, you're right, but the spirituality is not the meaning. The meaning is God. So I hear what you're saying. You can say that the spirituality, I hear what you're saying.
Gives meaning to the physicality.
The spirituality is the reason behind the physical, or meaning behind everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying. I think there is truth to that, but I think there's also truth to what I'm saying is that the meaning comes from God, not necessarily from the spirituality. But in other words, it's a little bit subtle for this conversation. But if we don't have spiritual realms and spiritual heavens and places that we can go spiritually, then we have nowhere to accede. Because if it would just be God and earth, we would have nothing to contrast ourselves with. We would never be able to grow and reach anything. We'd never be able to say that we are physical. Mm-hmm. Right? The creation of heaven and realms within heaven. By the way, we tell that there's numerous or infinite amount of realms within spirituality. The reason for that is to telling us that as much as we grow in the realm of spirituality, we can grow further. It gives us perception and ability to contrast. Contrast, we're going to see, is of intrinsic importance.
It's not, sorry, but it's not like a destination. It's more of a tool, isn't it? It's more of a tool. Like spirituality, I view as a tool to reach a higher plane. So it's not a destination. It's just like a tool to give meaning to that which is, or to Gashmiut.
100%. 100%. In other words, it's an explanation to yeah. And obviously, there's loads and loads of depths within spirituality, and there's lots of meaning in it way beyond it. Of course, all the worlds that the souls goes are spiritual worlds, and angels come from, and there's a mission and meaning within each of those existences. But we have to look from our perspective, what would be that meaning? And that's what it said, the ability to grow and just to contrast with what we have. Okay, there's so much more that we can go into. We could even go and discuss Rashi. Look at this. Rashi is the commentary over here. The commentaries on Bereshit are some of the longest commentaries, and he got such a fascinating one. I'm going to just do the first one, but I don't want to get distracted by it because it's really a distraction. But I just love it. You know, it says over here. Omer Rabbi Yitzchak. So Rabbi Isaac says, the Rashi, the first is the primary commentary on the Torah. What does he say? He says, Rabbi Isaac said, Yitzchak said, it was not necessary to begin the Torah except from this month. In other words, if the Torah is, let's get back. The Torah is what? It's a book of guidance and inspiration. It's not a history book. So why are we going back in history all the way? So he wants to give us one reason. And he says, well, one of the reasons is because why did not start from the first commandment? If the Torah is all about giving the Jewish people commandments, why does it have to tell us the history? So it says, why does it start with Genesis, with creation, to teach us koach mais of the strength of God, of the Jewish of God, that to tell his people that what his inheritance, lest the people of the world shall say, they'll come and say to the Jewish people that you have stolen the land of Israel. You conquered the land of the 7 nations. We go and say the whole land belongs to God. He created it and he gave it to who he saw straight in his eyes. And within his will, he gave it and to those first, he gave it to those 7 nations, and in his will, he took it away. Now, there's so much depth in this, and we can have a discussion. The Rebbe has numerous sikhs just on this little Rashi. As I tell you, the depth is unimaginable in these verses. But I wanted to show you something. It says, in the beginning, look at this. I'll show you in English. Perhaps you can say. There was a guy when I used to study in 770. 770 is Chabad headquarters, the Rebbe Shul in America. He used to say he was we used to call him Yossel the Shikir. He liked to drink. He was up at all hours of the night. We would see him always during the night in Bochum, as young students would stay up late. So he would say to us, Bereshit, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, lo haya tzarich. Which means is this: in the beginning, Rabbi Yitzchak says it wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary to create the world. Why did you create it? That was his joke, and I thought it was quite cute. In other words, what does the commentary say? It wasn't it, and you know what? It's not even a joke. God didn't have to create the world. He wanted to. He created by choice. Okay, that's just to give you an idea, and this is all of them. How much commentary are on this? That's just, of course, Rashi. On this portion, let's look at. We'll touch on verse 2 quickly, and then we'll go on to verse 3, which is where I love that verse in particular. There's a lot that we can talk about it. So it tells us, "V'haaretz hayta," the earth was astonishingly empty, and darkness was on the face of the earth. So tohu vavo. Has anybody ever heard of the term tohu vavo? I'm sure you all have. Tohu means it's like havoc. What does it mean, havoc? Whenever we want to talk about, when you walk into a room and there's a big balagan, we say tohu vavo. It looks like tohu vavo. What this means is God created the heavens and earth. This kind of, by the way, those people that are kind of, I don't know what they call them, apologetics or whatever, those people that like to try to make the Torah fit with science. It's not our discussion today, but an interesting discussion in and of itself. And to discuss how the theory of the Big Bang fits with the story of the Torah, because in the Big Bang, everything was just tohu vavo, everything was included, and it took years for them to come about. But we're going to see that that Big Bang theory, in theory, could have some truth, because it says that God created, boom, heaven and earth. It all came out. It could have been in a tiny little micro, tiniest little speck of even any existence, right? That's what the scientists want to claim, that in theory that's how small it would be. Everything would have been included within that tiny drop, but it would have taken time for that to come about. And there's actually a guy by the name of I've actually got a book about him that he's written. I forget his name. An Israeli, famous Israeli rabbi. I think it's something Cohen. and he writes and he tries to show how the accepted scientific description of creation of the Big Bang and how the world came into existence would fit perfectly with this description that we have in right over here, Genesis, Tovavo. Now, I'm not saying that that's correct or not, or whether you have to believe in it. I'm just pointing it out. So Tovavo, this word, that's like everything was included in that. Now, what does that mean? That created this darkness. Al Panei Tahom was. I don't want to get into what this Tahom is, but in whatever existence, universe, an empty universe had darkness. There was no light. There was nothing. Now it says the Ruach Elokim. Sorry, the Ruach Elokim, the Spirit of God, right? What does it do? It was hovering. Now, what does it mean to be hovering? What's the difference between hovering and residing? It was hovering on the face of the water, which is interesting because water is really created in day two. But in other words, it never had a place to stop and reside. It was so, the world, what it's telling us is that the Spirit of God created the world because what did he want? He wanted to reside over here. As I said to you before, the Midrash tells us that God had created the world. He wants to reside. But at this point, there was no space for God to reside. Only once he's achieved the third day, you'll see God says twice, he creates dry land. And then he creates the 7 days, we're told God resides within the world. Right? And then, of course, when we have the sin of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, that causes God to cease residing in the world to a certain degree. But the potential for God to reside in the world has not yet come into a place because there's nothing. God doesn't reside in the creation. God resides through the deeds of man. And the potential for the deeds of man is only once man is created. So now at this stage, God is just hovering. Okay? Merachefet. It's just hovering. Okay. Let's look at verse 3. This is a very important one. Why is this very important? Because it tells us, Vayomer Elokim. God tells us, first of all, what do we have? We have, once again, we're going to have all these utterances. Utterance number 1. Utterance number 2, first creation was really over here, Bereshit bar Elokim. Utterance number 2 is Elokim. Creates Vayomer. Now let's look at this word Vayomer, speech. We know that all the creations happened through the word Vayomer, speech. Okay. Now, what is speech? I'm busy talking to you now. What does that mean? So we define speech when somebody goes and talks to another person. What does that mean? They're communicating what's inside of their mind to the outside. Now, what is those things that are going on inside that person's mind? Those are thoughts, right? Or ideas, intellect that are inside that mind. As long as I'm not talking it to you, I'm not speaking, you don't know what's going on. So what does speech do? Speech is getting from inside of my essence to the outside. Now, what would you say is close to my essence? My thought or my speech? What is more me?
Your thought.
100%. Your thought. Definitely your thought. Because, hi, Joe and Naomi, I just saw now. But when I'm sharing screen, hard to see. When you see the thought, thoughts, first of all, thoughts are easy. It's just you as the being that you are, just living. You're always thinking. Things are always coming to your mind. Those are just being you. Speech is when you have to take you and send it outwards. You know, some people say that Trump is a great guy. He just doesn't know how to take his stuff outwards. Now, I'm not saying what I said. That's just an example of what some people think. You know, some people don't know how to let it go. They could have great ideas, but they can't express them properly. Now, the third thing that we do is we have to achieve. If you can just think and speak, but we can't achieve, what are we doing? So we need to do the hardest thing for us to do. You know what? You know, they say talk is cheap, right? Action is hard. Doing, achieving, that's where it's really difficult, because that's when you have to really immerse yourself. You have to really work on that. So action is the hardest. Speech represents when it's outside of you. So now, is God a human being that he has to speak? Who was he speaking to? Nothing else exists. This is the world. Is he talking to the world? You speak if you want to talk to somebody else. If there's another person to talk to, or if you have a little dog and you like talking to your dog, you'll speak. But if there's nothing else, there's no one else to talk to, who is God talking to? So the answer is God's not talking to anybody. The word speech is the only word that we can use to tell us that God wanted to take that which was inside of him, his ideas of creation, and put them out there. And therefore, he uses the concept of speech. Now, what does that teach us? That concept which we're calling speech, that teaches us that, number one, it's not the essence of God because it's not his thought. So we don't want to call it thought because it's not, the world is not the essence of God. It's not God. It's something outside of him. We want to create something outside of God. So therefore, what does he have to do? He has to say it. Say it takes from inside of me outside. He doesn't want to do action. Why? Because action displays having to work hard. But for God, the world is basic. It's nothing. It's so therefore, the closest term that we can get in order to express that idea would be speech. Okay? So that's why we're using the term speech. Now, as I always say, whenever I talk about this concept, one of my favorite concepts in Hasidus, that this, if you, one day I would love to do it, we'll get there. This is really explained more at depth in Shiur HaYichud V'Emunah, the part of the Tanya which talks about faith and creation. Okay, and there where it really elaborates on what the speech is. Now, what is really going on over here? So what's actually happening? So God creates. How does he create? What is the creation? What is it? So God, we spoke about at the beginning. What was God's first creation? Everything. Et, Aleph, Taf, from beginning to end. But what was it in particular? It was language. Language was where creation was going to happen, right? And what we're going to see is that all creation is basically language. It's words. Anybody seen The Matrix? Yeah, all those letters. You know, anybody in IT? Everything on the computer is just zeros and ones. I don't know if they still say that, but that's what I used to be taught in school. And I haven't studied anything since then in IT. So that's probably what they're still saying. It's all zeros and ones. So the world is all about, it's all letters. So every single letter has a different shape, and every shape expresses something else. So God creates letters. The first thing he does is he creates letters. And when he, so to speak, makes the creation, that turns into a word. So this only applies, by the way, with the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language is called Lashon Kodesh, the holy language. What does it mean, the holy language? The Hebrew language means, sorry, the Hebrew language is God expressing himself somehow. Okay? So this is the thing, you know, at a Brit Milah, as I said, I was at a Brit Milah today, and they called the child Adam, which was quite incredible, quite unique, because it's this week's portion, and they were talking about, they just wanted the Israeli family, new beginnings. Okay, Adam. Now, Adam, if you just take that word, this is a representation of man. What is man? Man is Adama Le'elyon. We are compared. We could either be, where do we come from? Adama, from the ground. Adama also means compared to the, we could be like the ground where we came from, or we could also be like our soul, which is compared to God. Right? So every Hebrew letter has a different meaning. And depending on how you put it together, the combination of the different letters makes different words. So God doesn't necessarily speak them out because, as we said, God doesn't have anybody to speak with. So he creates things through formatting letters. Now, does that mean that God actually created the letters? No, each letter is a representation of another spiritual concept. And when you formulate all those spiritual concepts together, you come up with a letter, and that's the way God has given to us. Because the way we work, the way God has created us, we say God has created us in his image. He's created us in a way that we always will work through words. We live through words. That's the ability that God gave us. The first thing God creates is words. Then we uses to create is these words. And that's the Vayomer. That's the speech. All right. I haven't even started this year. I just want to pause for a moment and say if anybody's got any questions.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Take it one at a time. Joe, just one for now, because I've got so much more that I've got to get through. But go ahead. Go ahead.
All righty. I'll address the elephant in the room.
Okay.
Anthropocentric, which means that the Torah of necessity, since it was aimed at the audience of humans, people, the whole Torah has to be written in a format and an understanding that humans can absorb. By its very definition, there's no point God writing the Torah in quantum physics language.
100%.
So what I'd suggest is like God has no need of alphabet or none of those tools or techniques. The entire Torah from the start to end is written in terms and tools designed for humans to take in.
100%. 100%. However, there's two modes of understanding this. The one way is the Maimonidic way, which is that God just simply had to talk in humanistic terms, and therefore he said speech because that's all we could relate to. Or there's a Kabbalistic approach, which is that it was a term that we could relate to, but it wasn't just a term. It had tremendous layers of meaning. In other words, when the Torah says Vayomer, it wasn't just, oh, well, that's the word that God could use. No, there was a particular word that God had to use because that is exactly what was happening. Now, it wasn't our Vayomer, it wasn't our speech. It was God's speech, but it was still speech, a different type of speech, something much deeper. And that's what we've been explaining, this concept of words. Okay? So,
well, but Rabbi, you mentioned the computer analogy. So the word itself has a very specific meaning in the IT world. Word refers to a unit of data. So different computers have different length words. They store the information in different ways. So, so the word, which is a fascinating, I'm sure we could have several shiurim just on this one thing itself, is that a word is the generic term we use for a package of data, of information. So when God brought the world and the universe into existence, there was a whole lot of information tightly packed in there, which expanded out to create the reality that we know. So a word to God is very, just like a year to God is very different to a year to us.
Yeah, but it's more than very different. It's a totally different thing. And all we can do is we can study the Kabbalah and see certain correlations. That's the best.
Yeah, I'm fascinated because Maimonides, Rambam, was a very scientific guy and very rational. So he tried to...
Right. So he gives a basic rational approach. That's what I'm saying. But what you really need is to study the Kabbalah and to see the essential meaning behind each actual word, and to say it's not just an arbitrary term in order for us to be able to relate to. Okay, let's go a little bit further.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again for a moment. So we're still in the middle of verse 3. So what does it say? What does God say? So this is Elohim once again. It's all the creations are done through Elohim, which is God's contraction. God is contracting himself, concealing himself really, in order, because what happens is like this. You'll see, Yehi, or what does God say? There should be light. Vayhi. Now, what's special about this? What is creation of light? This is the most magnificent creation, right? Light, the ability to have light. The ability for light. Why is this such a significant creation? Okay, so what does light allow us to do? Light allows us to differentiate. So there's different elements of light. There's light in the spiritual realm and light in the physical realm, right? Spiritual light is, or physical light is, if you're in a room that's dark, you don't know where anything is. You have to know, where is this and what is that? You want to stick your hand right now into, you want to find your bed, you want to find your keys, whatever it is. You have to be able to differentiate them between other things. You turn the light, you'll see it. Light allows you to differentiate between one thing and the other. If there was no light, everything would still exist. We just wouldn't be able to tell the difference between them. What does light allow us to do? It allows us to differentiate. The same thing is with intellect. Intellect is also light. If you have a person that knows something, this is good and that is bad, that's intellect. Light is the essence of everything, the ability to differentiate, to know when something is good. Now here's a powerful thing that the Rebbe says. Yehi, what does God say? We just said that there was a darkness. What does God say? Yehi, what happens? And there was light. The Rebbe said this very lesson is an extremely powerful lesson. Because in your darkest times, all that has to happen is you need a drop of light. Now what is light? Light is the word of Hashem. God says that there be light. No one else is called light. The Torah is called light. You take a drop of Torah and it could light up your day, it could light up your life. So it says Yehi, if you're lacking in life and goodness or happiness, first of all, don't despair, because you know that it can come in a moment. And number two is you can find the light inside of you, inside the Torah, inside of yourself. Now let's look at verse 4 for a moment. Sorry, I'll go back to verse 3 for a second, which is just one point I want to say. Vayhi. You know what, let's go to verse 4 for a second. So it says, Vayar Elokim. So what does God say? Here's a very strange verse. God says that the light, he sees the light, and he sees that it's good. Now, I don't know about you, but everything that we've been saying is that God doesn't necessarily see. What do you mean? God sees? God knows everything. He doesn't have to see. So what it's saying is that God is making it apparent that there's going to be an apparent difference between darkness and light. This concept is a deep concept within Hasidus, this concept of the difference between darkness and light. Now look at the next words. What does he call the light? He calls the light good, right? Because Kitov, he says, I see that it's good. What is goodness? What is goodness? Why does God say, what does it mean God sees that it's goodness? How is light good? What is the meaning of good? We haven't even defined what good is. So let's go back to our beginning. The only way you'll know that is if you remember the beginning. What was the beginning? That God has a purpose. His purpose is to have a dwelling place in this world. He wants to not just hover, he wants to reside in this world. God, anything is good is if it helps him fulfill its purpose. If it doesn't help God fulfill its purpose, it's no good. So what does he see as a direct help? Everything he's going to create is going to be a direct help for him to fulfill his purpose. So he sees that the light is good. He sees light is what's going to be used, is going to be, in other words, he says, light, spiritual light and physical light. But in order to gain spiritual light, you're going to need physical light. But particularly spiritual light is what we're going to need in order to be able to fulfill the mission of why the world was created. That's the definition of good. Good does not mean anything else. We say, oh, good is being nice. Good is No, that's our own definition of good. Why is your definition of good any different? This person defines good as one thing, another person, defines it as something totally different. You have to have an objective definition of good. That objective definition of good is a God-given definition. God says or is good. Now, what's God going to do then? He's going to make a separation. God is now going to separate between light and darkness. Now, look at what happens. Now, what is light and darkness? We think of God. Here's the strange thing. Do you think that darkness is a creation, or it's just the absence of light?
Oh, sorry, Rabbi, if you want us to answer, this is the question I've got as well. The same issue is looking at it is that darkness was on the face of. Now, the question is whether darkness is a vacuum or not. A lot of people interpret this as the absence of something, but then it says empty and darkness, so it differentiates between the two. So is the absence of good is not a vacuum. It sounds like there's something else that could replace it.
Okay, good. So the truth is that you're right. There's two definitions over here. Okay, so according to the Torah, there's 2 points. First of all, the Torah would say that there's two concepts of darkness. One concept of darkness is that darkness is actually just the voidance, the lack of good, the lack of light. But that concept, in order to have the concept of lack of light being darkness, needed to be created. But now, once it's been created, it's created that it exists when there's no light. Choshech is we're going to just say, if we just said that good is goodness, by the way, if you want to have ever discussion of what evil is, what is evil? Evil is darkness. What is evil? Evil is now a creation that's lacking good.
Oh my God.
Lacking light. Okay? When there's no light, that's when it becomes dark. That's when it becomes evil. In other words, evil is actually a creation, but the way it thrives and lives is when you don't have dark. So in other words, it's a vacuum. If you have darkness and evil in your life, the way you fill it is with light and goodness. Now, here's a very, very important thing. Vayavdil, this is the most controversial concept in all of Judaism, but it's also the most important concept in all of Judaism. And I say it's the most controversial because it is. People don't even realize this. People think that Judaism is just about everybody coming together and unity and love. We don't realize this. The only way that can happen is if we're able to distinguish between good and bad. One of the most fundamental concepts in Judaism is that the Torah says this is good and that is bad. This is kosher, that is not kosher. This is allowed, that is forbidden. That's a direct distinction. There's certain people that want to fight against that concept within Judaism and say, no, everything is good. How could we say that this type of person is can't marry that type of person? How could we say that? What about equality, egalitarianism? That's in theory nice, but fundamentally flawed in the perspective of creation. What God fundamentally creates is difference. Creations which are different. We are all different. Man, woman, Jew, non-Jew. Good, bad, all these things. Obviously, we're not talking about, not saying that we are, one is good or bad, but there's difference. And difference is a central, important thing that we have to recognize. Okay? Now, I'm not saying what is good. Difference does not necessarily bad, but here we're going to say, Vayavdil Kim Bein Ha'or, God wants to make this distinction between darkness and light. Why? Well, you'll say, well, darkness and light can't be mixed together. But God wants to make it apparent. What's the ultimate concept? This light, it says, God, if you look inside Rashi's commentary on this verse, I'm going to go down for a second. If you look over here, and God saw that it was, and he separated here too, we need to use the words of a God. And then God, he saw that it was not proper for the wicked to use it. So he separated for the righteous in the future. According to its simple meaning, explaining is as follows: he saw that it was good, and it was unseemly that it light and darkness should serve in confusion. So he established for this one its boundary by day, and for this established boundary by night. But what that really means is that God, you see that thing, he hid away the light for when it was good. Here's one of my favorite ideas. When God creates the very beginning of creation, you know what he creates? He creates the light of Mashiach. You know, we think that Mashiach is going to be something that's going to happen eventually, and there's going to be tremendous miracles, like I said earlier. No, this was the light. God created that light right at the beginning of creation. The creation, the light of the Mashiach has already been created. The truth is that we are now in a period of time before the revelation of Mashiach, where we're actually not in the natural time. We think that Mashiach is going to be supernatural. The truth is that Mashiach is natural. We will go back to the time prior to the separation, and that light will be revealed. Because as Rashi said, he hid that light away for the righteous. So we spoke about this, that in the beginning God created everything, and over here we're seeing it again. Okay, I'm going to finish off with the first day. Last verse, and this is the verse that concludes day one. Vayikra Elokim la'or yom. So God calls the first day, what does he call? Or, what does he call light? He calls it day. V'lachoshech, and to the darkness he calls night. Okay, now we all go through, Elie Wiesel. He goes through, I think he's got 3 books. I've only read the one book, but his main and most famous book is a book of his experiences in the Holocaust. And that book is called Night. Night is when we're going through difficulties. But you see something very interesting. Always darkness precedes light. Because look what he says. What does he call? He calls the darkness night, and then what does he says? Vahi Erev. First there was evening, and then there was morning. When does a Jewish day start? When does the Shabbat start? Does it start on Saturday morning? No, it starts the night before. You will always start the night before, and then you'll go into the night, into the day. The light will then shine. The Torah is teaching us, God is teaching us something very important, that in order to have creation, there was something that had to happen. First, there was the essence of God. God had to create a darkness. So what was that darkness? As emptiness. He had to hide his presence. He was there, but you wouldn't be able to see it. He had to create existences that wouldn't be able to see him. That creates this darkness. And what does he create afterwards? He creates physical light. Because, like when you have, the only way you're going to see the candle lighting, a light is only at night. If you go in the sun, in the middle of the sun, and you take a candle, you will not be able to see it, and it will have no impact. That candle. But if it's dark, you'll be able to see it. The only way we would be able to be physical people and able to appreciate physicality and see the physicality is if you hide away that awesome light of God, like the light of the sun, in order to see the light of the candle. But as a lesson, it's come to teach us that there's always going to be those dark moments before tremendous light. And I'll finish off with this point before I go into any further questions. We're going through a little bit of a dark period. But what we know from history is that it leads into a light period. And we pray that that light period should be the ultimate light period, about to occur with the coming of Mashiach very, very soon. Okay, so that's our analyzation of day one and the beginning of creation. And anybody wants any comments or questions, please feel free.
Oh yeah, yes.
Go.
So,
Go.
Rabbi, there's several opportunities there to. I'm trying to think of a diplomatic word other than disagree with the interpretation. There's, first of all, the older we get, the more we realize that real life has shades of gray in so many ways. And what is gray? It's a mixture of light and dark. So Bereshit was not written for the little kid, although at one level it can be. It's written for adults. So we have to address the existence of gray. The light and the dark got separated and then recombined.
I like that question. I like it a lot. Very nice question. Okay, I'm not saying I have the answer. I'll say this. Yes, please. Okay. I'll say this. Gray is a touchy subject. It's a controversial subject. Okay. Now, I agree with you that gray exists, and we have to be aware of gray. But we also have to be aware of the lack of gray. In other words, there's a time when gray has its place and it doesn't. From a biblical perspective, there's no such thing as gray. There's right and wrong. That's it. God gives us, when I became a rabbi under Rabbi Feitel Levin, we were taught that there's 4 books of Shulchan Aruch, of Code of Jewish Law that we could master. Not that I did. We master part of those 4 books. Some of it we don't have to master all of it, but we're told that there's a 5th part that we also have to master, and sometimes could be even more, which is common sense, and that's knowing when there are gray areas, when there are questions. The truth is that a gray area is not really a gray area. It's just a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of foresight in our area. There's no such thing as a real gray area. There's no such thing. If something is light and dark together, it cannot coexist, because light will always push away darkness. The second you turn on a light in a dark room, the darkness would fade. Okay? Now, the problem is that what you're going to see as we continue with Bereshit is that the people eat from the tree of knowledge, Tov Vara, Eitz Hadas Tov Vara. And what does that mean? That the ability to distinguish between good and bad, and that happens according to Chassidus. It's not what our discussion tonight, but you brought it up. The concept of good and bad becomes mixed in together. So now, when God creates heaven and earth, at the very beginning, he makes a clear divide between good and bad, between light and dark. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, they make, what happens, what changes, is that everything becomes gray. And now we are here pointing to black and calling it white. That is what is existing in our world. And the only way we can overcome that is with the Torah, the blueprint, where God, as I said, the blueprint does not have gray. There's no gray in the Torah. Have you ever looked at a Torah scroll? It's all black or white. It's black on white, as we like to say. It's as you get, right? The Torah is as clear as it gets, or maybe I shouldn't say as clear, it's as unclear as it comes. You've got to spend years upon years upon years upon years in studying. But the truth is there, and there is a clear answer. Even when the Torah, the Gemara itself, comes to the conclusion that Teku, there's no answer, the answer will be answered in Mashiach times, we still have to come to a conclusion. And in those questions, there's a halachic decision that has to be made. Okay, so it's a very difficult question. That's why I really like your question, but it's a really heavy question. So certain areas have gray areas, no question about it. But that's not the way it is in truth. It's only the way it is in our minds. Living in a world post the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge, we live in a gray world. But that is our world, not God's perspective. From God's perspective, there's no difference.
Well,
I
may I add, Rabbi?
I hope I've clarified that a little bit.
Yeah, can I add that in space, when astronauts travel beyond the atmosphere, that's exactly what they encounter. On Earth, because of the cloud, because of various things, the clouds and so on, we experience shades of grey. But on the moon, for example, when they go for a walk, there can be literally a line in front of them where on one side where the sun's shining, it's boiling hot. And on the other side, centimeters away, it's freezing cold and there's no grey in between.
Wow. Quite incredible.
So, but for us, we experience, sunset, sunrise. There's shades of grey through twilight, through dawn. What was the old joke about this person who was wondering, staying awake all night, wondering where does the sun go at night? And then it dawned on him.
I like that. Beautiful. Okay, any other questions, points, comments?
Leon Irene has a question, I think. Not sure.
Yeah.
She wants to say bye, I think.
No, I really enjoyed it, but I need to go already. Thank
No
you
problem.
very much. It was
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really interesting. Very,
Thank you.
very, I haven't heard anything like this before, so I'm just beginning to learn.
Okay, well,
Thank
that's where we've got to start. I'm also beginning to learn, so we'll learn together. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, have a good night. Bye. All right, anybody feel free to ask or to leave. No need to apologize. We're already over time. Any other questions?
No, I'm going to say thank you very much, Gershon. It was beautiful.
Yeah. Scott.
See you next time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Good to see all of you.
Anytime you want, Rabbi, I'd be happy to set up a shiur. We can really delve into this because
Okay.
for me, it overlaps with, as I say, with quantum physics, with maths, with so many science areas.
Once you enter into Bereshis, there's no end. You're 100% right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. Another analogy I was going to share is one that a lot of people are familiar with is electricity. Is you look at the terminals of a battery, we all know there's positive and negative. That's what we call them, positive and negative. But the words themselves, the labels, are fascinating. Are we saying that the negative terminal is evil? It's far worse in value than the positive terminal, and the positive terminal is the good one?
I don't know if that. Well, we need both. Correct. We cannot have one without the other. Now, I'll tell you one point that I didn't say that the Rebbe points out based on your question. He says that you'll see that good and bad is equally divided. It says erev avoker, and he says that well, darkness and light is equally divided because ultimately you need to have both. So, in other words, bad. If you need bad, that means ultimately it's good.
Yeah,
because you cannot live without it. Good would not be good without bad. And the only way that you can grow and really get to the next level and even contrast and define out what good is when you have the bad. So that's why sometimes bad will even appear, or the darkness, whatever you want to define it, as being even more powerful. But it's an existence, and not only that, God divides it, and He starts off with it. And the Rebbe said the very fact that He starts with darkness shows on its importance and its tremendous significance in accomplishing the ultimate purpose within creation. Yeah. So, and you're right. You can't get rid of either.
Thinking of that electrical analogy again is so. Again, in science, positive and negative. That what differentiates them at the atomic level is that the positive has there's a difference in the electrons that circulate. And so one of them has more electrons than the other. One of them has vacancies for electrons. And when you connect the positive and negative, what happens is that the surplus electron transfers across so they can both reach equilibrium. And that's what we call electric current flowing, is when the surplus electron jumps across and occupies a vacancy. Okay, so I'm thinking of darkness and light in the Bracious in a similar way, is that initially they're both created from the same stuff, but when they're pulled apart, one has elements that are missing from the other, and then it wants to flow across to fill the vacuum to equalize to equilibrium again. So there's a tension between the two.
100%. I think that's a perfect analogy, almost perfect analogy for what we're discussing. And I think that's the way God creates everything within the world. This concept that we spoke about today of that positive and negative energies and those things, I think that's the paradigm of God's creation. It's not an accident that electricity works that way. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And that would help us understand that in the beginning, everything was empty. Even darkness didn't exist, because darkness is the opposite form of light, but darkness does not equal nothing.
Exactly. 100%. That's exactly what the point is.
Yeah. And that's
it's
hard
the
for
lack
people
of
to get their heads
light,
around.
but it's not nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's negative light, if you like.
It's negative light. In other words, it has to be created.
Yeah.
I think the Rebbe once said in a Sikha, he was once talking and he said something like how is darkness a creation? Or what does it mean to have positive darkness or something like that? I don't remember the exact concept. And he said, well, it's something that we can't really properly fathom, but it's there because the Torah tells us that he created it.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, it makes sense because it exactly aligns with physics and science, and that a true vacuum where there's nothing is actually very hard to find. But to have two opposing forces which complement each other, if that makes sense, that's more rational.
Right. Okay, I hear you. Yeah, two complementing.
It's what was the old joke that explains this about the guy that goes to his doctor and says, doctor, one of my legs is shorter than the other. And the doctor says, relax, it's all part of the design. God made your other leg longer to compensate.
100%. It's a good one. Right. Yeah. Very interesting. I like that idea that you said now. It's a good one. All right. Thank you so much. I think we could talk about this for hours if we wanted to. And
Tikkun Leil.
Tikkun Leil. Oh, that's a good idea. Tikkun Leil. Let's take out the books.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, Naomi. Good night. Good night, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
We'll see you soon, hopefully.
Will
Bye.
do. Thank you.
Bye.